Last week we looked at that snapshot of Isaac and Jacob and how Jacob had deceived his father and his brother and manipulated to be able to get the inheritance. And we saw about how Esau, who was deceived in the midst of that, came back in the end and forgave his brother for what he had done. Just a beautiful, beautiful picture of what Christ has done for us and shows us how to be forgiving as well to those that have caused injury to us in our lives. As we're looking through the story of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, we're kind of moving into the Jacob and Joseph stage today. But to do so, to get to that story, we're going to set the background. I'll retell some of the story that took place in the middle of last week's sermon. We had when young Jacob deceived his father and his brother, but then we saw the end of how Jacob later in his life was forgiven. But there's a window of time that we skipped over last week, and we're going to go into that window of time today and set the background of what happened in Jacob's life in the meantime. And so you can find all of this in chapters 29 to 38 of Genesis. Lots of detail about this family, and to try to read it all directly from there, I would say do it at home in your free time. To do so, I'm going to retell the main parts of it. But if you think your family has dysfunction in it, this family is one of the most dysfunctional families you can ever find in the whole Bible. They were real people, real problems, and we're going to take a look at that here. You know, Jacob had used manipulation and deception in his youth to be able to get what he wanted, and we're going to find that it's going to come back to haunt him a little bit here today. But because he had done this, he feared for his life, because his brother was angry and wanted to kill him, and so Jacob thought it best that he leave, and so he took off to his distant relatives in a faraway country and settled there with them. And when he was there, he fell in love with one of his distant cousins, a young woman named Rachel. Now, Rachel's father, Laban, was also quite a conniver himself, as we see that he's going to be a thorn in the flesh for Jacob. But Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, and Laban said, well, if you work for me for 7 years, then I'll let you marry her. Right? 7 years, that's a pretty long time to give your life to be able to marry the one you love. But he was so in love with her that he didn't care, and the Bible even said that the time flew by to him because he had the hope of something good that was coming at the end of those 7 years. So, back in those days, the wedding ceremony went like this. Instead of having the wedding and then the wedding night happened first, and then the wedding celebration happened afterwards. So things were different in that culture. So when it came time for the wedding night that preceded the wedding, Jacob goes into the tent with who he assumes to be Rachel, who he's worked for 7 years, but it turns out that it wasn't Rachel that he consummated the marriage with. It turned out it was her older sister, Leah, because her father, Laban, said, well, Leah's older and she hasn't been married off yet, so according to my traditions, I want to make sure she's married first, so therefore he tricked Jacob into marrying Leah, the sister. And you can imagine, I don't know how you can go through the wedding night and not realize who you were with, but maybe he was waiting for 7 years for this and he didn't care, and it just, anyway, we'll leave it there. But anyway, when Jacob realized what he had done, or what had been done to him, he was very angry at Laban. Hey, I spent 7 years for Rachel, and you gave me Leah instead? Now, you can imagine how Leah felt in the midst of all that. She's the unwanted sister, So Laban said, well, I'll strike you a deal. If you work for 7 more years, then you can have Rachel too. So Jacob agreed. So 14 years of his life was spent working for his father-in-law, obtaining a wife that he wanted and obtaining a wife that he didn't want. So he ended up with 2 of them. Obviously, he somehow decided, well, I got tricked into it, so I'm just going to settle to having these 2 wives. And so those 14 years went by. So Jacob, who had manipulated and deceived before, got manipulated and deceived in his own life by somebody else. You can imagine, though, the situation. He's got a wife that he loves and a wife he doesn't love. He's got both of them. The wife that he doesn't love, Leah, is able to give him children, which was very important at that time, to be able to build your family. And she kept giving him more and more sons. And, of course, this kind of raised her status in the family. It didn't mean he loved her anymore, but he did have children through her. Rachel, whom he did love, was barren and couldn't give him any children. Could you imagine the jealousy and competition that takes place in the family like that? Poor Jacob with two wives that are at odds with each other because one is blessed in one way and one is blessed in a different way. Rachel was the one that was loved, not Leah, but Leah gave him the children that gave her some status. So to make things worse, Rachel, who couldn't produce any children, came up with the idea that said, hey, I have a servant girl that helps wait on me. Jacob, you can have her for your wife as well, and she'll bear children, and I'll be like the foster mother for these children. And that was a culturally acceptable thing to do. So Jacob sits back and goes, okay, Rachel wants children, and, we'll give her children this way. So he takes on a third wife to do so, who is able to give him a couple of sons. But meanwhile, Leah says, well, wait a minute. If Rachel's catching up to me in children, then I'm going to give Jacob my servant girl so he can have children through her as well. And so this whole plan goes on that Jacob ends up with 4 wives, ends up with children from at least 3 of these wives. Could you imagine the chaos in a family like that? The servant wives didn't have the status of the wives that he had originally married. The children from those marriages would have competition with, you can imagine. These kids think, well, I'm more loved and I'm more important around here because this is my mom. Your mom is the servant girl, and you could imagine just the competition, the things that went on there. And you think, where's Jacob in the midst of all this? Well, we already know he was pretty cowardly. He didn't have a backbone. Obviously, he's in the midst of the situation, not standing up for what is right in his home. He could have stopped all this right at the very beginning and made some sense to all this chaos, but he just let it keep growing and growing and growing while he was passive and just let it go on. He had this house full of women, a house full of kids, and from all the details that we read, there's so many details about this whole story. We never see Jacob getting into the situation and saying, wait a minute, let's solve this God's way. And all these ridiculous plans and all this competition and envy and strife and jealousy just grew and grew and grew because he didn't step in and take the role that he needed to take as the father, as the husband, as the man of God who would be able to set some of these things straight. We know that he was a very cowardly person. In fact, and I mentioned it last week, even when Jacob was going to meet his brother, not knowing he was going to be forgiven, but his brother had an army of 400 soldiers. And cowardly Jacob, he puts his wives and kids up front, and he hides behind. That's how cowardly he was. No backbone, very passive. He didn't take control of his home. He didn't take control of his family. He didn't say, hey, let's stop and say, what does God want for our family? When he was deceived that night, he didn't stop and say, okay, I got deceived. I ended up with a different wife than I planned for. What does God want? How can we fix this situation? He didn't stop and do that. Instead, more plans, more everything into his own hands, and just letting life happen out of control. So you could imagine what kind of family this was. None of us would want to be in that family. You would admit that you wouldn't want to be one of those wives or kids in that family. That just would not be a good situation. We agree with that. Eventually, though, God opened up the womb of Rachel, the loved wife, but the one without her own children. God had mercy, opened up her womb, and she gave birth to a son that we know as Joseph. Several years later, she gave birth to a second son, but in the midst of birth, she lost her own life. She passed away during childbirth. The son Benjamin was born, and she didn't have the joy of being able to really raise her sons And so could you imagine then Jacob, the wife that he loved now has given him 2 sons, but she's gone. You can imagine that the competition and the strife between the brothers and the other wives would still continue after this. We know that it's poor taste to love one child over another in the family, but that's what took place here. Of course, we know which son Jacob loved the most, and that was his firstborn son from Rachel, Joseph. We know that he got some preferential treatment. And when we think about what was going on then, the other sons who were much older, they're already, adults by the time that Joseph is being born and raised, because a lot of time has passed. They're probably thinking, okay, the inheritance is going to go to who? It's going to go to our younger brother, Could you imagine how insecure they felt about their position? And there's a lot of brothers. There's 12 of them. And there were some daughters born. We don't read too much about them. But in this culture, the sons divided up the inheritance. But it went to the oldest son to be able to carry on the family name, to be able to carry on the bulk of the family inheritance. But there was a lot of situations going on in this family where there was a lot of insecurity and jealousy, and this was going on. So that gets us to our text that we're going to look at today. We're just going to look at this short text from Genesis 37, and it tells us about Jacob and Joseph. It says, Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. Those were the servant wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel, which was Jacob's name, it was changed to Israel. He was the father of the 12 tribes. He loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. And when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all of the other brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peacefully to him. In Jacob's old age, had received the son that he really wanted from his wife Rachel. And Joseph receives the preferential treatment here. And we read about how, as a 17-year-old Joseph, he's out in the flock, he's out with his brothers, taking care of the flocks, and his brothers are goofing off and not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So he comes back and tells dad about it, tattletale. Okay, we're not talking about little kids here. We're talking about, these are grown men, his brothers are. They're grown men. And this 17-year-old, which, there's a lot of maturity in 17-year-olds. They can handle this. They're not necessarily going to be tattling like a 6-year-old's going to do. But he's just coming back and giving a report. I'm sure his dad's saying to him, how's things going out there? Joseph's going, well, to be honest, they're goofing off. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, etc., etc. So, of course, they get reprimanded, and that makes the brothers all the more angry at Joseph because he's the goody two-shoes of the family. I mean, if you have a goody two-shoes and then everybody else is causing trouble, well, who's really the guilty one? It's really not the goody two-shoes. Joseph was doing what he was supposed to be doing. And from everything we know about Joseph, reading the story of his whole life, he was the most upright, righteous man, one of the most upright people we find in the whole Bible. And we're going to get into that next week, because we're going to show how even if you grew up in a dysfunctional family, God can change things, and he can make you upright and righteous, and you can make good decisions, and we're going to see that in Joseph's life. So from everything we know about Joseph, I don't think he was a bad kid being a little narc and a tattletale and trying to get his brothers into trouble just because he wanted to cause trouble. He was upright. He did what was right, even as a teenager. He was in a place where his heart was right. Somewhere along the way, even though Jacob had done very poorly at raising his other sons, maybe by now in his old age, maybe he's raised Joseph in a way to be able to see God. Maybe Jacob's learned a lot about God in his life through the things that have happened, through his mistakes. And by now in his old age, he's able to pass on some wisdom. Maybe he's a better father to Joseph than he was to his first sons. There's a lot of kind of reading between the lines here, but Jacob now had maybe an understanding of how to raise his children, and therefore perhaps Joseph was raised with the fear and the admiration and worship of God that his brothers didn't have. In some other chapters, we read about how even Jacob's wives, both Rachel and Leah and the servants, they had their little gods that they took around with them. They didn't necessarily worship the God that Jacob was supposed to be worshiping, the God of his grandfather Abraham, who had appeared to him and said, "Y'all make you a great family." You know, Jacob allowed worship of other gods to take place in his home. So I'm sure these sons, growing up from mothers who were influencing them, perhaps away from the one true God, Jacob didn't put a stop to that. And even today, as parents, as grandparents, whatever influence we have, and we don't have little rock and wood idols sitting around our houses. Our idols might look like this. Our idols might look like this. Our idols might look like many other things that we allow our children to be able to worship more than the one true God. And when we are not allowing God to be the first priority in our families, then we're already adding to the recipe of dysfunction in our families. God has to be the first place in our families and raising him that way. And as fathers, as mothers, we come together and we set aside the idols of this world and say, let's be a family that worships the one true God. Let's be a family that puts God first. Let's be a family that are being raised, where the kids are being raised in the admonition of the Lord. Perhaps the reason that Jacob favored Joseph as well is because Joseph was an obedient kid. You know, it wasn't necessarily maybe that he loved him more, although we're told that he loved him more, but it's a lot easier raising a child that's obedient, that's walking in the ways that we can be proud of. The wanderers out there, the prodigals, you know. I mean, these other sons had been raised and now they're off living their life in a way that didn't please their father. That was difficult for him. You know, there's still love there, but it's hard to be able to raise a child that's gone in that direction. Perhaps Jacob in his old age, not to let him off the hook, but maybe his passiveness is still just, you know, I failed with these, I'm letting him go, and I'm just going to focus on Joseph here. Not that that was the right thing to do. That's definitely not the godly thing to do, but perhaps that's where he just was in his life. And so he's rewarded. Jacob is rewarded, or Joseph is rewarded by getting this beautiful, beautiful coat, the coat of many colors. And I know in Sunday school we see all these pictures of a little boy, but he's a 17-year-old, okay, given this cloak that kind of gave the idea that he is next in line. He is the one that's going to carry on the family blessing. And so his brothers are pretty upset about it. Now we're going to get into next week the story of what happened with this jealousy and how it changed the course of Joseph's life. But we do know that it's very easy for us today, no matter what family we came from, what family that we've raised, what family we have around us, it's easy to blame others and say, if only he would do this, or if only she wasn't like that, or if only he would change, if only she would put herself in my shoes, if only he would grow up, if only she would quit thinking about herself. I mean, these are things we say about our family members because we get frustrated when people aren't living up to the expectations that we have of them. I know I think of those things often about people in my family. If only, if only, if only. Instead of looking at myself, we put out the blame and we expect other people to rise to the occasion instead of looking at the way we can respond to the dysfunction around us. If we would take that if only and we would turn it on ourselves and say, if only I could respond to that behavior in this way or that way. It doesn't necessarily say that what they're doing is right or that we approve of it, but we can't necessarily change people. We can't necessarily let their problems be an excuse that we respond in a way that is no better. Because often, our response is pride, that we are better than they are, because we don't do that. We don't act that way. We would never say things like that. And that pride is a sin that creates division as well in those relationships. And when we stop and get our focus off of other people, and this is so hard to do because you're in the middle of this situation and these people aren't acting the way you want them to, it's so easy to get the focus on them. But if we could stop and say, who am I before God in the midst of this situation? How can I have the proper attitude, the proper words, the proper actions to be able to respond to it? When it comes down to it, dysfunction is a nice, good psychological term, but dysfunction is really sin. When people are dysfunctional, they're sinning in some sort of way. But the good thing is that despite the fact that this is sin, God has a remedy for it. God has a remedy for our dysfunction. He has a remedy for our sin. And he steps in, and if we can focus on him instead of the people around us who are disappointing us and not living up to our expectations, then we can start with ourselves. Maybe by changing ourselves, it might, not guaranteed, it might have an effect on those people around us. But when it comes down to it, we do answer to God. We don't answer to those people. They don't answer to us. They answer to God as well. And sometimes we just have to kind of put up some boundaries that says, you may be dysfunctional and you may be not living up to the right expectations of what a husband or a wife or a child or a parent should be. But I'm going to answer for me. And I'm going to look to God and let him work within me so at least I can be right. And hopefully it will spill over. And I think that a lot of times when we respond right, it does change the people around us to some extent. Some more, some less. But if we're looking for God and we see his purity and we see a lack of purity in our own lives, then we can start there. If we look at God, we see his forgiveness and we see a lack of forgiveness in our own lives, then we can start there. If we look at God, we see his peace, but we lack peace in our own lives, then we start there. If we see God's kindness and we see a lack of kindness in our own lives, then we start working there. When we see God and his joy and we lack joy in our own lives, then we start there. If we see God's honesty and we realize that we haven't been as honest as we need to be, then we start working there. When we see God's wisdom and we realize the foolishness of our own thoughts and behavior, then we start there, following God. Just the imitating thing that Kim talked about it here. We start imitating these things. When we see God and we see his sacrifice of love and we realize how hard it is for us to sacrifice, we start there. And there's a lot of areas we can start working on. And maybe we kind of work on everything at once a little bit, or we just kind of delve into one area. God will lead us. But when we look to God and we see the qualities of God that we lack, and the change starts inside of us, then we grow and we can handle the circumstances around us. We can handle the sins of other people, the dysfunction of other people in a way that we couldn't on our own. When we realize that we ourselves are sinners as well, and when we go to the cross, when we go for forgiveness, when we go for a renewed focus on saying, God, transform me, transform my mind, transform my heart, transform my tongue, transform my body, so that I can be a reflection of you, then he comes into that place, those places that are dark, and shines light on it. We have sinned, our parents have sinned, their parents sinned, and their parents sinned, and their parents sinned. Our children sin, and their children will sin, and their children will sin. It's a part of who we are. But God says, I want to rise above that sin. I want to bring forgiveness. I want to bring healing. I want to bring a new view of how to relate that would imitate the way that God relates even to us. And as we live that out, then we're able to make a difference in the world around us.